She stole that uniform. My father's voice cracked through the Fairfax County courtroom like a rifle shot. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Not the clerk. Not the bailiff. Not even Judge Robert Halstead, whose reading glasses had frozen halfway down his nose as he stared over the bench at the man shouting from the plaintiff's table. My father stood trembling, one finger pointed straight at my chest. The gold trim on my navy dress whites caught the afternoon light from the courthouse windows bright enough to sting the eye. "That woman is a fraud," he barked. "She stole that uniform and she's trying to steal my family's land." Whispers rippled through the gallery. I heard my name pass from mouth to mouth like a rumor too scandalous to keep quiet. Abigail Mercer. Frank Mercer's runaway daughter. The girl who'd vanished 12 years ago and come back wearing honors no one in Cedar Ridge, Virginia believed she'd earned. My attorney, Margaret Bell, didn't flinch. She sat beside me at the defense table, her silver hair perfectly arranged, one hand folded over a yellow legal pad. If she felt any surprise at my father's outburst, she hid it well. I kept my face still. That had taken years to learn. You don't survive military service by reacting to every insult thrown your way. You learn stillness. Stillness unnerves people. Across the aisle, my younger brother Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking smug enough to choke on. He wore a navy blazer and the same crooked smile he'd worn at 16 when he'd convinced our father I'd broken the taillight on his truck. Some things never changed. Judge Halstead cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer, this is a court of law, not your church social hall. Sit down." Father lowered himself slowly, but his eyes stayed fixed on me. They were pale blue, the same shade as mine, though his had long ago hardened into something cold and suspicious. For a moment I saw him exactly as he'd looked the day I left home, standing on the farmhouse porch with his jaw clenched, telling me if I walked away to join the Navy I needn't bother coming back. That had been 12 years ago. Long enough for my mother to die. Long enough for Daniel to inherit Father's easy affection. Long enough for me to become someone neither of them could imagine. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish. Outside, late September sunlight slanted across the courthouse lawn, where red and gold leaves had begun to fall. It was the kind of Virginia afternoon my mother used to love. The kind she'd spend on the porch swing with a glass of sweet tea, watching the world turn slow and golden. I wondered what she'd think if she could see this. Her husband accusing her daughter of fraud. Her son sitting smug and silent. Her family reduced to a property dispute over 87 acres of Mercer land and the truth buried beneath it. Margaret rose. "Your Honor, if the plaintiff is finished with theatrics, the defense would like to proceed." Judge Halstead gave a short nod. "Proceed." Margaret turned toward the bench. "Mrs. Eleanor Mercer amended her will 6 months before her death. The amendment grants equal ownership of the Cedar Ridge property to both her children." Daniel's smile vanished. Father's knuckles whitened around the edge of counsel table. "That amendment was forged," Father snapped. Margaret didn't look at him. "We have notarized copies and corroborating testimony." "That girl disappeared for over a decade," Father said. "No calls, no visits, no funeral attendance when her own mother died." "That one landed." "Not visibly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But I felt it. A quiet blade turning where old grief still lived. I hadn't missed my mother's funeral by choice. I'd been halfway around the world on orders I couldn't break and missions I couldn't explain. By the time the message reached me, she was already buried beneath the maple tree she'd chosen herself. Father knew that. Or he'd chosen not to know. Margaret glanced toward me, then back to the judge. "My client was serving this country under conditions protected by federal classification." Father laughed bitterly. "Oh, that's rich." The gallery stirred again. This was small-town Virginia. People here believed military service was sacred, but only when they understood it. A woman gone 12 years who suddenly returned decorated and composed. That unsettled them. It didn't fit their understanding of how life worked. Judge Halstead folded his hands. "Mrs. Bell, unless you can provide documentation." The courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. A young Marine courier stepped inside carrying a sealed navy blue dispatch envelope stamped in red. "Urgent, eyes only." The room fell silent. The Marine crossed directly to Margaret's table, saluted me crisply, then handed her the envelope. No expression. No hesitation. Just duty. Margaret accepted it as calmly as if she'd expected him. Because she had. She walked to the bench and handed it to Judge Halstead. This, she said quietly, is the documentation. The judge frowned at the Pentagon seal. He broke it open. The first line hit his eyes. And everything changed. The color drained from his face. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Robert Halstead stood. Then he reached up and removed his robe. The gallery gasped. Even Daniel sat forward. Judge Halstead folded the robe over the back of his chair with military precision. Then he looked directly at me. His voice was steady and solemn. "All rise." My father's face went pale. "Wait," he whispered. "What?" For a second after Judge Halstead said those words, no one moved. The courtroom sat frozen in a kind of stunned confusion, as if every person there had suddenly forgotten what standing even meant. Then the bailiff rose first. He was an old Marine himself, broad in the shoulders, despite his years, and the moment he pushed back his chair, something changed in the room. The clerk stood next. Then the gallery. Then Daniel. And finally my father, though he rose slowly, his face gone so pale I thought he might collapse. I stayed seated. Judge Halstead looked at me not as a judge, not even as a fellow Virginian, but as one service member recognizing another. Then he gave the slightest nod. Only then did I stand. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. No one said another word. Then Halstead cleared his throat, sat again, and carefully pulled his robe back on. The spell broke. He looked older somehow. More human. His eyes settled on my father. "Mr. Mercer," he said evenly, "you would be wise to remain silent until this court has reviewed all evidence." My father opened his mouth. Closed it. Daniel stared at me like I'd become someone else entirely. And in truth, I had. But becoming that person had cost more than either of them would ever understand. 12 years earlier, I'd stood on another Virginia porch under another September sky. Back then, I was 23, angry enough to mistake anger for courage. The Mercer farm stretched behind me in rows of soybeans and fading pasture grass, all of it glowing gold in the late afternoon light. The kind of land men like my father believed could anchor a family forever. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his face carved from the same hard lines as the Blue Ridge foothills behind our property. "You walk down that driveway," he said, "don't expect to come back." My duffel bag sat at my feet. Inside was everything I owned. A few clothes. My acceptance papers for officer candidate school with the United States Navy. And the photograph of my mother holding me as a baby, both of us laughing at something beyond the frame. I looked past him into the house where I'd spent my whole life trying to earn love that always seemed reserved for someone else. Daniel was 17 then, already broad-shouldered and confident. Already father's pride. He stood halfway down the hall watching us, that same little smirk already forming. To him, this was confirmation. Abigail was finally proving what everyone knew. That she didn't belong. Mother stepped out behind father, her face pale with worry. "Frank," she said softly. He didn't turn. "She'll quit in a month," he said. "I won't," I answered. He laughed once, low and sharp. "You're not built for service, Abby. You've spent your life pretending to be tougher than you are." The words landed exactly where he meant them to. That was his gift. Finding the tenderest part of a person and pressing there until they bent. But then my mother moved around him. She took my hand and placed something cool and heavy into my palm. It was my grandfather's service medal. Bronze worn smooth at the edges from decades of careful handling. My grandfather had earned it in Korea before coming home to farm this same land. Mother closed my fingers over it. "You come from stronger people than fear wants you to remember," she said. I nearly cried right there. Not because of father. Because of her. Because she believed in me with a certainty I had never managed to give myself. I left 10 minutes later. Father didn't say goodbye. Daniel didn't wave. Mother stood at the porch rail until my bus disappeared down Cedar Ridge Road. That was the last time I saw her alive. Officer candidate school stripped away every softness I had. The first 6 weeks nearly broke me. Sleep deprivation. Physical punishment. Constant correction. The humiliation of learning that determination alone doesn't make you exceptional. I failed navigation drills twice. Collapsed during a forced march. Got screamed at by instructors who looked at me like I was proof some experiment had gone wrong. More than once I sat on my bunk after lights out and thought about quitting. And every time I heard my father's voice, "You'll wash out in a month." So I stayed. Not out of patriotism at first. Not even pride. Spite. Pure stubborn Mercer spite. Funny what keeps you alive long enough to become something better. Eventually that bitterness burned itself clean. Discipline replaced it. Then confidence. Then purpose. Years later, assignment to Naval Special Warfare Intelligence Support changed everything. The work was classified. The stakes were real. The missions invisible. No medals pinned publicly. No applause. Just responsibility heavy enough to reshape a life. And because secrecy was part of survival home became impossible. Calls were rare. Letters censored. Visits non-existent. Mother understood. She always understood. Which made what happened next unbearable. I learned she'd died from Margaret Bell nearly 6 weeks after the funeral. A cerebral aneurysm. Quick, they said. No suffering. As if that helped. As if grief measures mercy by minutes. Margaret mailed me Mother's final voicemail. I listened to it alone in government housing in Norfolk at 2 a.m. Her voice was faint but steady. "Abby, if you hear this, then I'm already gone. I need you to know your father is wrong about many things, but especially about you. One day he'll know exactly who you are, and when that day comes, be kinder than he deserves." I played it 12 times. Then I cried harder than I had since childhood. Back in the courtroom, my hands rested steady on the defense table. But inside that old ache had returned. Not sharp anymore. Just deep. The kind grief becomes when enough years smooth its edges. Judge Halstead looked down at the dispatch again. Then back at my father. And for the first time since this trial began, I saw uncertainty enter Frank Mercer's face. He didn't know what was written there. But somewhere deep down he already feared the truth. And fear had always been the one thing my father could never hide. Fear has a way of changing a man's face. You don't notice it at first. It hides in little things, the stiffening of the jaw, the restless tapping of fingers, the way the eyes stop meeting yours and begin darting toward exits. That was what I saw now in my father's face, as Judge Halstead folded the Pentagon dispatch and set it carefully on the bench. Frank Mercer had spent his entire life convincing people he was the steadiest man in Cedar Ridge. The man who never panicked. The man who always knew the right answer. The man who built Mercer Agricultural Supply from a 2-room hardware store into the county's largest distributor of seed and fertilizer. People trusted men like that. Respected them. Sometimes even feared disappointing them. I had spent most of my childhood chasing his approval the way some children chase sunlight, certain, if I could only reach far enough it would finally warm me. But fear had found him now. And it looked strangely familiar. Because I had worn that same expression once. Judge Halstead adjusted his glasses. "This court will recess for 15 minutes while I review these materials in chambers." His gavel came down sharply. The room erupted at once. Voices rose. Chairs scraped. People leaned together whispering. Small-town gossip moved fast, and what had just happened would feed Cedar Ridge for months. Margaret touched my arm. "Come with me." We slipped through the side door into a narrow consultation room with paneled walls and a single humming fluorescent light overhead. It smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish. Margaret closed the door behind us and let out a long breath. Well, she said that certainly landed. I looked at her. She gave a rare smile. At 72, Margaret Bell had spent 40 years practicing law in Virginia and had stared down enough judges, bankers, and self-important local men to qualify as a regional natural disaster. Nothing rattled her. Not even today. "You knew exactly what was in that dispatch," I said. She sat at the small table and folded her hands. "Your mother made sure I would." That tightened something in my chest. Even now, hearing Eleanor Mercer spoken of in the present tense of memory had power enough to steady me. Margaret tilted her head toward the empty chair across from her. "Sit down, Abigail. There's something you need to hear before we go back out there." I sat. Outside the door, muffled courthouse noise drifted through voices, footsteps, the distant clang of the security scanner at the entrance. Ordinary sounds. The kind that made extraordinary moments feel somehow more real. Margaret reached into her leather briefcase and withdrew a sealed manila envelope yellowed slightly with age. My name was written across it in my mother's careful script. I stared at it. "I've held on to this for 6 years," Margaret said quietly, "per your mother's instructions." My throat tightened. "She told me to give it to you only if your father ever forced this matter into open court." For a moment I couldn't breathe. Even dead, my mother had seen farther ahead than anyone else. Margaret slid the envelope toward me. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "Abigail, if you're reading this, then your father has chosen pride over love again." I prayed he would not. But prayer does not erase a man's nature. It only gives us strength to face it. "There is something you must understand. 6 months before I died, Frank came to me desperate. Daniel had mortgaged portions of the Mercer land through speculative investments he did not fully understand. When those ventures failed, your father covered the losses with additional debt. He thought he could recover before anyone knew. He could not. They needed your share of the property to keep creditors from forcing a sale. That is why I changed my will. Not to punish your father. Not even to protect the land. I changed it to protect you. Because I knew if they were desperate enough, they would lie to take what was yours. And because one day, whether your father admits it or not, he will need to face the truth about what he did to his daughter. When that day comes, remember this. Mercy does not mean surrender. Love does not require permission. And your worth was never his to grant. I love you always. Mother." By the time I reached the signature, my vision had blurred. I blinked hard and folded the letter carefully. Margaret said nothing. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. She understood silence better than most people understood speech. After a minute I asked, "How bad is it?" She answered plainly. "Very." She opened another folder. Inside were bank statements, property liens, refinancing records, and corporate filings. The Mercer Company is nearly insolvent. Daniel leveraged future agricultural contracts to secure private loans. Then commodity prices dropped. He doubled down to cover losses. I stared at the numbers. It was worse than I'd imagined. This land is collateral. Yes. I thought of the farm. The maple tree where Mother was buried. The porch swing. The soybean field stretching under September sun. Every memory of home reduced to line items on a debt ledger. If they secure your signature, Margaret said, they can consolidate ownership, refinance again, and delay foreclosure. And if they don't, they lose everything. There it was. The real reason for this lawsuit. Not outrage. Not wounded pride. Desperation. Father had dragged me into court and accused me of impersonating a naval officer because he needed one final signature to save himself. A laugh escaped me, then small and humorless. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What? All those years I said I thought he hated me because I disappointed him." Margaret's expression softened. "No, Abigail." She leaned forward. "Your father feared you because your mother saw your strength before he ever could. Men like Frank don't know what to do with what they cannot control." That landed deeper than I expected. Because somewhere beneath every scar he'd left, part of me had still believed I simply hadn't been enough. Margaret reached for her papers again. "There's more." She withdrew another document. A Pentagon release order stamped with federal authorization. 6 weeks ago, portions of your overseas service record were declassified. I stared. "That operation in Izmir." She nodded. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "The extraction mission. The embassy siege. 41 civilians evacuated under live hostile fire. The mission no one outside our command structure was ever supposed to discuss. It's public now. Enough of it is." My breath slowed. And suddenly I understood. Not just what was in Judge Halstead's envelope, but what came next. My father had built this entire case on the assumption that no one could prove who I was. He had gambled everything on secrecy. And secrecy had just expired. A sharp knock sounded at the consultation room door. The bailiff opened it halfway. "Court reconvenes in 2 minutes." Margaret rose. I stood with her. She straightened the front of my dress whites with motherly precision and gave me a small nod. Ready? I thought of my mother's letter folded inside my jacket. Of 12 lost years. Of every insult my father had ever thrown like stones. And for the first time since coming home I felt no anger. Only certainty. Yes, I said. Then we walked back into court where my father was waiting to learn exactly who his daughter had become. When Margaret and I stepped back into the courtroom, the noise died almost at once. That's the thing about small-town courtrooms. They're not grand marble halls like the kind people see on television. Fairfax County's Civil Division sat inside a brick building that had once housed the post office, and the room itself was plain enough oak benches polished by decades of nervous hands, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a state flag standing slightly crooked behind the bench. But when something unusual happened there, the whole place seemed to know. And what had happened 15 minutes earlier was the sort of thing Cedar Ridge would talk about for the next 50 years. The gallery had grown during recess. Word had spread. A few local attorneys stood along the back wall pretending they had business nearby. Mrs. Chandler from the diner sat near the aisle, clutching her purse like she was attending Sunday service. Old Sheriff Collins had appeared too, his weathered face unreadable beneath his white mustache. Everyone had come to see what happened next. My father sat rigid at the plaintiff's table. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, Frank Mercer had always carried himself like a man who expected rooms to part for him, but the certainty had gone out of him. Beside him, Daniel kept adjusting his tie with jerky little motions. His confidence had cracked. He was trying not to show it. Neither of them looked at me. That alone told me enough. Judge Halstead entered through the side door and took his seat without expression. The bailiff called the room to order. Then silence settled. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. Halstead folded his hands and looked first at my father, then at me. His face gave nothing away. But his eyes had changed. There was recognition there now. And something heavier. Respect, perhaps. Or memory. He cleared his throat. This court has reviewed documentation submitted under federal authority by the United States Department of Defense. No one moved. The contents have been independently verified through direct contact with the Pentagon. A murmur passed through the room before the bailiff barked order. Judge Halstead continued. The plaintiff's claim that Abigail Mercer fraudulently impersonated a commissioned naval officer is categorically false. My father's shoulders stiffened. Daniel's face lost color. Halstead reached for the dispatch envelope and withdrew a single typed page. Even from where I sat, I recognized the formatting. Official release language. Precise. Clinical. The kind of words that reduce extraordinary events to dry factual record. The judge adjusted his glasses and began to read. By authority of the Secretary of Defense, selected operational details concerning Commander Abigail Mercer's actions during the emergency diplomatic extraction in Izmir, Turkey, are hereby declassified for legal verification. The courtroom had gone utterly still. I heard someone in the back inhale sharply. Halstead's voice remained measured. On March 14, 2020, Commander Mercer assumed field command after the incapacitation of senior leadership during hostile engagement at the United States Diplomatic Annex. Daniel blinked rapidly. My father stared as if he'd stopped understanding English. The judge continued. Commander Mercer directed evacuation protocols under active hostile fire, resulting in the successful extraction of 41 American personnel and Allied civilians. Her actions prevented catastrophic loss of life. No one whispered now. No one shifted. It felt as if the room itself had stopped breathing. The words carried me backward whether I wanted them to or not. Izmir had smelled of smoke and concrete dust. The annex alarms had screamed so loudly they became part of the air. Lieutenant Grayson was bleeding out against the communications wall. Commander Patel had gone down 30 seconds earlier. And suddenly command was mine. Not because I wanted it. Not because I was ready. Because everyone else was dead unconscious or trapped. Fear had come then sharp and clean. The kind that narrows your whole world to the next right decision. I remembered shouting coordinates over gunfire. Remembered dragging a wounded diplomat down a stairwell slick with blood. Remembered forcing my own shaking hands to stay steady long enough to clear civilians onto extraction transport. And afterward, once everyone was safe, sitting alone inside the transport hold while my whole body trembled so hard I could barely breathe. That was heroism in real life, not pride. Not glory. Just terror endured one decision at a time. Judge Halstead lowered the page. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, he rose. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his robe again. The fabric slid from his shoulders with a soft rustle. Beneath it, he stood straight-backed, despite his age every inch the Naval Reserve officer he had once been. He faced me. Then he saluted. The movement was crisp enough to make my throat tighten. His voice rang clear through the room. All rise for Commander Abigail Mercer, United States Navy, in recognition of extraordinary service to this nation. The room stood at once. Every person. The bailiff. The clerk. Sheriff Collins. Mrs. Chandler from the diner. Even Daniel, though he looked half-conscious. And my father. My father stood there trembling, staring at me as if seeing his daughter for the first time. I rose and returned the salute. Properly. Steady hand. Locked elbow. Eyes forward. When Judge Halstead lowered his hand, the room sat again. Only my father remained standing. His lips moved soundlessly for a second before words finally came. No, he whispered. The single syllable carried farther than a shout. This isn't possible. Judge Halstead fixed him with a hard stare. It is possible, Mr. Mercer. Father looked at me, panic widening his pale eyes. You lied, he said weakly. And that was when I understood. He needed that to be true. Needed it more than breath itself. Because if I had really done these things, if I had become exactly what he'd sworn I never could, then he would have to confront the full measure of his failure. The judge's voice sharpened. Commander Mercer served where most Americans will never know danger existed. You will address her accordingly. My father's mouth opened. No sound came out. Then Margaret Bell stood. Your Honor, she said, smooth as polished oak, the defense has one final witness. The side door opened, and Daniel's former business partner walked into the room carrying a banker's box full of records. The look on my brother's face told me everything before the man said a word. The real trial was about to begin. The moment I saw Thomas Keegan step through that side door carrying the banker's box, I knew my brother's world had just ended. Daniel knew it too. You could see it happen in real time. His body gave him away before his face did. His shoulders jerked upward like a man bracing for impact, and his right hand, always his tell when he was cornered, began tapping the table in quick, uneven bursts. Tap, tap, tap. He'd done that when we were children, right before confessing to whatever lie had finally collapsed around him. Across the aisle, my father noticed it too. His head turned slowly toward Daniel. For the first time all afternoon, real uncertainty entered his expression. Not fear for himself. Fear of what he might learn about the son he had trusted without question for 37 years. Thomas Keegan was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, and plainly dressed with thinning sandy hair and the weathered face of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He'd grown up 2 farms over from ours. I remembered him from childhood cookouts and county fairs, laughing beside Daniel while the grown-ups swapped stories over barbecue and sweet tea. He had once been Daniel's closest friend. Now he walked to the witness stand without looking at him. That said enough. The bailiff swore him in. Judge Halstead leaned forward. State your name and occupation for the record. Thomas Edward Keegan, agricultural finance consultant. Margaret approached him with measured calm. Mr. Keegan, did you formerly serve as chief financial officer for Mercer Agricultural Supply? Yes. How long? 8 years. And why did your employment end? Thomas hesitated. Then he looked directly at Daniel. Because I refused to sign fraudulent loan disclosures. The room erupted. Judge Halstead's gavel cracked down. Order. My father turned sharply toward Daniel. What is he talking about? Daniel didn't answer. His face had gone gray. Margaret waited for silence, then continued. Please explain to the court. Thomas opened the banker's box and removed a stack of binders thick with tabs and highlighted pages. His voice was steady, but I heard sadness beneath it. Not anger. Regret. About 18 months ago, Daniel began using future crop delivery contracts as collateral to secure short-term private loans. The contracts were inflated, some entirely fabricated. A collective intake of breath swept the gallery. Thomas continued. When commodity prices dropped, the company couldn't cover repayment schedules. Instead of disclosing losses, Daniel refinanced through secondary lenders using portions of Mercer family land as collateral. My father's chair scraped backward. You mortgaged the land. Daniel finally looked at him. It was temporary. Frank's face went white. How much? Daniel swallowed. 4.8 million. The number hit the room like a blast wave. Even Sheriff Collins muttered something under his breath. My father's voice shook now. You told me 200,000. Daniel's mouth worked soundlessly. Margaret stepped closer to the witness stand. Mr. Keegan, did Mr. Mercer Sr. know these figures? Thomas hesitated. And in that hesitation, the whole room leaned forward. Yes, he said quietly. The sound my father made then wasn't quite a word. It was smaller than that. The noise a man makes when his own lies finally become visible to everyone else. Margaret turned toward the bench. Your Honor, Exhibit 12 includes signed refinancing authorizations bearing both plaintiff signatures. She handed copies to the clerk, who passed them up. Judge Halstead reviewed them in silence. Across the aisle, my father stared at Daniel as if he'd never seen him before. And perhaps he hadn't. Not really. He had spent a lifetime seeing only what confirmed his own judgment. Daniel was the son who stayed. The son who obeyed. The son who inherited. That had been enough for father to call it goodness. But obedience and character were never the same thing. I had learned that years ago. Now he was learning it too. Margaret spoke again. One final question, Mr. Keegan. Why come forward now? Thomas looked toward me. His expression softened. Because Eleanor Mercer once told me that truth has a way of waiting patiently until people are finally ready to hear it. At the mention of my mother's name, something tightened in my chest. That sounded exactly like her. Margaret nodded and returned to counsel table. The room stayed hushed as Judge Halstead set the documents down. Then he looked directly at my father. Mr. Mercer, would you care to explain why you accused your daughter of fraud while concealing your own financial misconduct? Father rose slowly. For a moment I thought he might answer. Might finally tell the truth. Instead, years of pride surged to the surface one last time. This family was mine to protect, he said, his voice rising. Everything I did was for this family. It was an old refrain. I'd heard versions of it my whole life. Every criticism had been for my own good. Every withheld kindness had been discipline. Every act of control had been protection. For years I'd believed him. I stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. Father looked at me, still flushed with righteous desperation. And suddenly I saw him clearly. Not as the giant of my childhood. Not as the man whose approval had once defined my worth. Just an aging, frightened man who had mistaken possession for love so many times he no longer knew the difference. When I spoke, my voice came calm and even. Number? The word echoed softly. He froze. I held his gaze. It was never yours to protect. His expression faltered. And then I said the truest thing I had ever spoken to him. It was yours to love. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Not theatrical. The kind that settles when something undeniable has finally been said aloud. My father's face changed. The anger drained out of it all at once, leaving only age and grief and something like shame. For the first time in my life, he looked small. Judge Halstead's gavel struck. This court finds in favor of the defendant. Ownership rights remain equally vested under Eleanor Mercer's amended will. Furthermore, this court refers evidence of financial fraud to the Commonwealth Attorney for criminal review. Gasps filled the room. Daniel slumped into his chair. Defeated. Broken. My father didn't move. The gallery slowly began to stir, people whispering, as the truth settled over Cedar Ridge like fresh snow. Margaret touched my arm gently. It's over. But as we gathered our papers, I heard my father's voice behind me. Quiet now. Stripped of command. Abigail. I turned. His pale blue eyes, my own eyes reflected decades older, met mine. Please, he said. Can we talk? And for the first time in my life, he sounded like a man asking instead of demanding. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I nodded once. Outside beyond the courthouse windows, the September sun was already beginning to set. By the time we reached the farm, the last of the daylight had gone soft and copper-colored across the fields. Virginia sunsets always did that in early fall. They didn't disappear all at once the way they did farther south. They lingered, fading slowly over the Blue Ridge as if reluctant to leave. I had forgotten that. Forgotten how the land itself seemed to exhale at dusk. The courthouse crowd had long since scattered. Margaret had driven back toward town after pressing my hand and telling me to call if I needed anything. Daniel had left with his attorney without saying a word. That left only my father and me. He drove separately, his old black Ford pickup rattling slightly the way it always had. I followed behind in my rental sedan, watching the familiar roads unwind beneath the headlights. Past Miller's feed store. Past the white-steepled Baptist church where Mother had sung alto every Sunday for 20 years. Past the weathered sign that read, "Welcome to Cedar Ridge Population 2814. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. When we turned into the long gravel drive of the Mercer farm, something inside me tightened. The farmhouse stood exactly as memory had preserved it. White clapboard siding, wide front porch, green shutters beginning to peel at the edges. The porch swing still hung from its chains near the far rail. Mother's swing. A single lamp glowed inside the front window, casting warm gold across the darkening yard. For one aching second, I could almost believe she'd step through the screen door with 2 glasses of sweet tea and smile as if no time had passed at all. Instead, my father climbed stiffly from his truck and stood waiting beneath the porch light. He looked older here. Smaller. Court had stripped something from him and home had not yet given it back. Neither of us spoke as we climbed the steps. The boards creaked beneath our feet exactly as they had when I was 10 years old, sneaking outside after bedtime to watch thunderstorms roll across the valley. Father sat carefully on the porch swing. He gestured toward the rocking chair beside it. I sat. The quiet stretched between us. Crickets hummed from the fields. A dog barked faintly somewhere down Cedar Ridge Road. Inside the house, the grandfather clock ticked through the open screen door. Ordinary sounds. The kind that make truth harder to avoid. Finally, my father spoke. "She always believed in you." His voice sounded rough, as though it hadn't been used in years for anything honest. I looked out at the darkening fields. "Yes." He nodded once. "She used to tell me I was blind where you were concerned." A dry laugh escaped him. "Turns out she was right." I said nothing. Some silences are invitations. Others are mirrors. This one was both. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his broad hands clasped loosely. Those hands had built this porch, fixed our tractors, lifted hay bales and fence posts and all the practical burdens of a farming life. They had also pointed at me in judgment more times than I could count. Age had thickened the knuckles and raised blue veins beneath the skin. For the first time they looked fragile. "When you were little," he said quietly, "you followed me everywhere." The memory surprised me. I hadn't thought of it in years. Him repairing fences while I trailed behind carrying nails too big for my hands. Watching him work with fierce admiration. Certain my father could fix anything. He gave a faint, humorless smile. "You wanted to learn everything, engines, wiring, bookkeeping, didn't matter what it was." His eyes stayed on the porch boards. "And every time I looked at you, I saw how much like Eleanor you were." That caught me off guard. I turned toward him. He kept speaking slower now. She had that same look, like she could already see a better world than the one standing in front of her. His throat tightened visibly. "I loved your mother more than I knew how to say, and somewhere along the way I started resenting anything that reminded me she saw farther than I did." The words landed softly, but their truth hit hard. He rubbed one hand across his mouth. "When you talked about service, about leaving Cedar Ridge, I heard her voice in yours. And I knew if you left, you'd prove something I'd spent my whole life refusing to admit." "What?" He looked at me then. Straight on. That this land wasn't enough. I let that settle. Then I shook my head. "You never understood her." Pain flickered across his face. "No," he said. "I didn't." The honesty in it startled me more than any apology could have. For years I'd imagined this conversation. Imagined rage. Vindication. 1,000 sharp words finally returned. But sitting here now looking at the man age had hollowed and pride had diminished, anger felt strangely unnecessary. Not because what he'd done was small, because it was already finished. The damage had long since shaped us both. Nothing I said tonight could deepen it or erase it. He drew a shaky breath. I was wrong about who you were, Abigail. There it was. Simple. Unadorned. No excuses attached. No conditions. Just truth. His pale eyes glistened in the porch light. The sight unsettled me more than if he'd shouted. Frank Mercer did not cry. Not when his own father died. Not when drought nearly took the farm in '94. Not even at Mother's funeral, from what people told me. And yet now tears stood unshed in his eyes, because he had finally seen his daughter clearly and understood what it had cost to wait this long. I'm sorry, he said. The words came out uneven, like something long rusted finally forced into motion. I believed him. That was the strange part. Not because apology erased anything. It didn't. But because for the first time in his life he was speaking without armor. I sat very still. Then I said the only honest thing I had. I can't give you what you want tonight. His face fell slightly, though he nodded. I know. I'm not ready to forgive all of it. You shouldn't be. The answer surprised us both. A sad little smile touched his mouth. Lord knows I haven't earned that. And somehow hearing him say it loosened something deep inside me. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something quieter. Release. The need to keep carrying this hurt like proof of what had happened. I exhaled slowly. Then reached into my jacket and placed Mother's letter in his lap. He stared at the familiar handwriting and went perfectly still. She knew, I said. He nodded once, unable to speak. I rose from the rocking chair. The night had deepened fully around us now. Stars were beginning to gather over the fields. I'm going to visit her in the morning. He looked up. Would you tell her for me? The question nearly broke me. I swallowed hard, then gave a single nod, and walked down the porch steps into the dark, leaving my father alone with the truth my mother had written years before he was finally ready to read it. The next morning came cool and clear, the kind of Virginia autumn morning that makes the whole world feel newly washed. A thin mist still clung to the lower pasture when I stepped out of the farmhouse just after sunrise. Dew silvered the grass, and somewhere down by the tree line a mourning dove called its soft, familiar song. For a moment I stood on the porch and breathed. The air smelled of cedar and damp earth and distant wood smoke drifting from some neighbor's chimney. Home. Not the version I had spent 12 years resenting. Not the version memory had polished into something softer than truth. The real thing. Weathered. Imperfect. Still standing. I had slept poorly. Not from anger. That was gone now, or at least changed into something quieter. No, what kept me awake had been the strange lightness settling inside me. For so many years I had carried my father's judgment like a second skin. Even after promotions, commendations, impossible missions survived, and impossible decisions made, some hidden part of me had still been waiting for him to tell me I had finally done enough. That hunger had shaped more of my life than I cared to admit. And now it was simply absent. Not fulfilled. Gone. Like waking one morning to discover an old injury no longer aches when the weather changes. I walked across the backfield toward the maple tree where my mother was buried. The grass brushed softly against my shoes. Beyond the pasture, the Blue Ridge Mountains rose blue-gray against the brightening sky, steady as they had been every day of my life. Mother had chosen this spot herself after Granddad died. She used to joke that if she had to spend eternity anywhere, she preferred a view. The maple stood halfway down the slope, its leaves blazing orange and red in the early sun. Beneath it sat two modest headstones. My grandfather's. And hers. I knelt before Eleanor Mercer's grave and laid my hand against the cool granite. For a long while I said nothing. Grief changes with age. When it first arrives, it is sharp enough to split you open. Years later, it becomes companionship. A quiet presence walking beside you through ordinary days. I took my grandfather's bronze service medal from my pocket. The same one Mother had pressed into my hand 12 years earlier. The edges were smooth now from years of carrying it overseas across oceans and deserts and places whose names would never appear in public record. It had sat in my breast pocket during operations where fear felt close enough to taste. A reminder of where I came from. A reminder that courage often looks smaller and plainer than people expect. I placed it carefully at the base of her headstone. Then I spoke. "He read your letter." The breeze stirred the maple branches overhead. I smiled faintly. He finally listened. A lump rose in my throat. For a second I was 23 again, standing at that bus stop with my whole life packed into a duffel bag, terrified and pretending not to be. Only now I understood what Mother had known all along. Leaving hadn't been rebellion. It had been becoming. And coming back wasn't surrender. It was proof that home could be reclaimed without being reduced by it. I stayed there until the sun climbed high enough to burn away the mist. Then I rose and walked back toward the house, feeling strangely certain about what came next. 3 months later, Cedar Ridge Veterans Retreat opened its doors. The Mercer land had been divided by court order. Daniel took the business assets and spent most of his share paying legal settlements. He left Virginia shortly after chasing some fresh start in North Carolina, from what little I heard. My father remained on the farm. We spoke occasionally. Briefly. Carefully. Healing, I had learned, is rarely dramatic. It moves like roots underground, quiet, invisible, slow. Some weeks later, he began volunteering at the retreat. No speeches. No explanations. He fixed broken fence rails, repaired plumbing, mowed the grounds. Service in the language he understood best. That was enough. The retreat itself had grown from a simple idea. A place where aging veterans could rest, recover, and remember they were not forgotten. Nothing fancy. Just 12 renovated guest cottages, walking trails through the backwoods, a common dining hall, and wide porches built for conversation. The kind of place people over 60 seem to understand instinctively. A place where no one needs to explain old scars. On opening day, our first guest arrived, retired Army Sergeant Walter Hensley, age 78, Vietnam veteran, widower hands, trembling slightly from Parkinson's. He stepped onto the porch of Cottage 3 and looked out over the fields for a long moment. Then he turned to me with tears standing openly in his eyes. "I haven't felt peace this quiet in 40 years, he said. I didn't know what to say. So I simply stood there with him, letting the silence hold what words could not. After a while he smiled. "You know," he said, "the strongest people I ever knew weren't the loud ones." I thought of my mother instantly. Walter looked out at the fields again. They were the ones who stopped needing to prove who they were. The words settled deep. That evening, after guests had finished supper and the sky had begun its slow copper fade across Cedar Ridge, I stood alone on the main porch and watched the light go. Somewhere behind me, laughter drifted from the dining hall. Soft. Real. Earned. And I finally understood what honor meant. It was never the uniform. Not really. Not the medals or salutes or classified commendations hidden in Pentagon files. Those things mattered, yes, but they were symbols. Honor lived somewhere quieter. In truth told late, but told anyway. In wounds carried without bitterness. In choosing to build where others once tried to break. That day in court, everyone rose because of the uniform I wore. But I finally stood because I no longer needed it to know my worth. If this story brought you back to your own memories of family, of service, of the long road toward forgiveness, I hope you'll carry that reflection forward. Share it with someone who may need it, and if stories like this speak to your heart, you're always welcome here. Some truths take a lifetime to hear. Sometimes they're still worth hearing. The end. The moment I stepped through the ballroom doors, 200 Navy SEALs rose to their feet so fast, their chairs scraped against the marble floor like gunfire. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. A commander near the entrance straightened his posture and shouted with the kind of force that rattled crystal chandeliers. "Admiral on deck." And then came the silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that makes people suddenly aware of their own breathing. My mother's face drained of color. My younger sister Melanie stood frozen beside her wedding cake, one hand still wrapped around her bouquet. And my father, the same man who had texted me less than 24 hours earlier telling me nobody cared about my Navy career, looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. I wish I could tell you that moment felt good. For 30 years I'd imagined some version of it. Some moment where people who dismissed me would finally understand who I'd become. But standing there in my white dress uniform with 4 stars on my shoulders, all I really felt was tired. Tired enough to realize revenge rarely arrives the way you imagine it. The strange thing about humiliation is that it ages with you. I was 58 years old standing in a Charleston ballroom, yet part of me still felt like the skinny 17-year-old girl sitting at my parents' dinner table, while my father praised my little sister for being sweet and criticized me for being difficult. Back then, Melanie could do no wrong. She was homecoming queen. Church choir. Beautiful smile. Perfect manners. And me? I was the girl who asked too many questions. The girl who wanted to join ROTC. The girl who talked about aircraft carriers instead of weddings. My father used to laugh whenever I mentioned the military. Claire, he'd say women don't belong on warships. That was in 1985. I remember because Ronald Reagan was still president, and my mother was cooking meatloaf when I announced I wanted to apply to the Naval Academy. Melanie nearly choked, laughing. My father folded his newspaper slowly and looked at me like I'd embarrassed him. You'll grow out of this phase. But I didn't. If anything, the Navy became the one place where people finally stopped asking me to shrink myself. At Annapolis, nobody cared whether I smiled enough. Nobody cared whether I looked pretty at church socials. They cared whether I could lead, whether I could endure, whether I could stay calm when things got hard. Turns out I could, though my family never quite forgave me for it. Over the years, our phone calls became shorter. Birthdays forgotten. Holidays missed because I was deployed. My father once introduced me to a neighbor by saying, "This is our daughter Claire. She works for the government." Works for the government. At the time, I'd already commanded thousands of sailors. But I smiled politely because after a while disappointment becomes routine. 3 days before Melanie's wedding, I was sitting inside my office at Naval Station Norfolk reviewing retirement paperwork when my phone buzzed. Dad. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken properly in months. Instead, I opened the message. "No one cares about your Navy career. Please don't embarrass us by wearing that uniform to Melanie's wedding." I stared at the screen a long time. Outside my office window, gray Atlantic rain hammered against the pier. Young sailors hurried between buildings with their collars turned up against the wind. I remember feeling strangely hollow. Not angry. Not surprised. Just tired. After all those years, my father still believed my service was something shameful, something attention-seeking. I set the phone down carefully. Then I laughed once. A quiet laugh. Because by then I'd spent more than 3 decades making life-and-death decisions under pressure, and somehow a text message from an 80-year-old man still had the power to hurt me more than enemy fire ever had. That evening I nearly decided not to go. I poured myself a glass of bourbon in my Norfolk townhouse and sat alone in the quiet. No husband. No children. That part of my life had slipped away somewhere between deployments and promotions. David, my ex-husband, used to say the Navy always came first. At the time, I denied it. Now I wasn't so sure. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was Ramon Hayes. Master Chief Ramon Hayes. Retired SEAL. One of the best men I'd ever served beside. "Tell me you're still going to Charleston," he said immediately. "How'd you hear about that?" "Claire, half the East Coast defense community's invited to this wedding. Word travels." I sighed. "I'm thinking maybe I should stay home." There was silence on the line for a second. Then Ramon spoke softly. "You spent 30 years standing your post for people who never thanked you. Don't start hiding now." That hit harder than I expected. Ramon had seen me during some of the ugliest years of my career. He'd seen me after casualty notifications, after buried friends, after impossible decisions. If he thought I should go, maybe I needed to listen. "You really think it matters?" I asked. "No," he said, "I think you matter." I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I pulled my full white dress uniform from the garment bag hanging in my closet. Gold buttons polished. Sleeve stripes immaculate. 4 silver stars waiting on the shoulders. I ran my hand across the fabric slowly. People imagine uniforms make you feel powerful. Sometimes they just remind you how much life they cost. By noon, I was driving south toward Charleston in my black sedan with old jazz playing softly through the speakers. The highway stretched endlessly beneath gray Carolina skies. Billboards, gas stations, church signs, tiny southern towns where American flags fluttered outside hardware stores. The kind of places where people still say sir and ma'am. By the time I reached Charleston, evening sunlight had turned the harbor gold. The wedding venue sat along the waterfront like something out of a magazine, white columns, enormous oak trees, strings of lights swaying in the breeze. Valet attendants hurried between luxury cars. Women in pastel dresses laughed beneath champagne tents. And suddenly, at 58 years old, I felt like an unwanted teenager again. I checked into my hotel quietly under my maiden name. The receptionist recognized me from television almost immediately, but was polite enough not to mention it loudly. That night my mother called. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to say she missed me. Just one sentence. Please try not to upset your father tomorrow. I stared at the hotel window overlooking Charleston Harbor after she hung up. Somewhere out there, Navy ships cut through black Atlantic water beneath the dark. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to admit something painful. No matter how many medals sat on my chest. Part of me still wanted my parents to be proud of me. I arrived at the wedding venue early the next afternoon because old military habits die hard. 15 minutes early had been drilled into me since my plebe year at Annapolis. Even after all these years, I still couldn't bring myself to arrive fashionably late like civilians seemed to enjoy doing. The Charleston air was warm and heavy with salt from the harbor. White folding chairs lined the lawn overlooking the water, and a string quartet played softly beneath enormous live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was beautiful. Melanie always had a talent for beautiful things. Beautiful clothes, beautiful homes, beautiful friendships that looked effortless. Growing up, she could walk into a room and instantly belong there. I always felt like I was studying the room instead. A young valet opened my car door. The moment he saw the 4 stars on my shoulders, his expression changed completely. "Good afternoon, ma'am." His posture straightened automatically. I nodded politely and handed him the keys. The reaction wasn't unusual. Military people noticed details civilians overlooked. But the wedding guests gathered outside the venue barely looked at me at all. To them, I was simply an older woman in uniform. Maybe a ceremonial escort. Maybe somebody hired for the event. I carried myself quietly toward the entrance heels, clicking against the stone walkway. Then I saw my mother. Barbara Bennett stood near the reception tent, wearing a pale blue dress and pearls that had belonged to my grandmother. Her smile appeared instantly when she noticed me, but it never quite reached her eyes. "Oh, Claire," she said softly, glancing around nervously, "you really wore it." I looked down at my uniform. "Yes, Mom, I did." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "It's just, this day is supposed to be about Melanie." There it was. Same song, different decade. I kept my tone calm. "I'm attending my sister's wedding respectfully." "Yes, but people might misunderstand." I almost laughed. People misunderstand women in uniform all the time. But before I could answer, my father approached. Harold Bennett still carried himself like the high school football coach he'd once been. Even at 80, he moved with stiff authority, though age had curved his shoulders and softened his hair into thin silver. The moment his eyes landed on my uniform, his jaw tightened. "You actually did it." "Good to see you too, Dad." He ignored that. "You couldn't let Melanie have one day?" I stared at him in disbelief. "I'm standing here quietly." "You know exactly what you're doing," he muttered. That hurt more than I expected. Because the truth was, I had spent my entire adult life trying not to make my family uncomfortable with my success. I changed subjects during holidays, avoided discussing promotions, never corrected them when they minimized my career. And still somehow my existence felt offensive to them. My father leaned closer. "You could have worn a normal dress." Normal. I'd heard that word my whole life. Why can't you be normal? Why can't you settle down? Why can't you stop trying to prove something? Before I could respond, Melanie appeared. She looked stunning in her wedding gown. For a moment I saw the little girl who used to follow me around the backyard when we were children. Her expression softened when she hugged me. "I'm glad you came. I wouldn't miss it." Then she stepped back and awkwardness returned to her face. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She hesitated. "Would you maybe consider taking off some of the medals during the reception?" I blinked slowly. The medals. They just draw attention. I looked at my little sister standing there in diamonds and lace, still afraid of sharing space with me after all these years. And suddenly I didn't feel angry. Just sad. "I earned these, Melanie." "I know," she said quickly. "I'm not trying to be mean." I know. But she was. Not intentionally, perhaps. Still, the message was clear. Shrink yourself. Again. Before the conversation could continue, wedding guests began arriving in larger groups. Luxury sedans rolled up one after another. Men in tailored suits. Women carrying expensive handbags. Politicians. Business owners. Retired officers. Charleston society. I quietly moved toward the back rows near the water, hoping to avoid further tension. That's when I noticed the first change in atmosphere. A gray-haired man across the lawn froze mid-conversation, staring directly at me. Then another. Whispers began spreading subtly through the crowd. At first I assumed they recognized the uniform itself. High-ranking military dress attire attracts attention, especially in formal settings. But then a retired captain I'd worked with years earlier approached carefully. "Admiral Bennett." I smiled politely. "Captain Morris, been a long time." "Yes, ma'am." The ma'am came instantly, almost reflexively. Nearby guests overheard. Heads began turning. Within minutes, more former service members started recognizing me. Some approached respectfully. Others simply nodded from across the lawn. One older Marine colonel placed his hand over his heart briefly before returning to his seat. I could feel my parents watching all of it uneasily. My father especially. For him, this was unfamiliar territory. At home in Charleston, he was the respected man. The center of attention. The authority. But here among military circles, that authority belonged to me. The ceremony itself began beautifully enough. Sunlight danced across the harbor while vows were exchanged beneath white roses. I stayed quiet in the back row. Clapped politely. Smiled when appropriate. Tried not to think about how emotionally exhausting the afternoon already felt. Afterward, guests moved into the grand ballroom for the reception. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings. Servers carried trays of champagne. A jazz band played old standards near the dance floor. I deliberately chose a small table near the rear corner of the room. Far from the family. Far from attention. Or so I thought. A few minutes later, a young Navy lieutenant approached my table nervously. "Excuse me, ma'am." "Yes." "I just wanted to say it's an honor to meet you." He couldn't have been older than 25. Fresh-faced? Sharp uniform. Probably reminded me of myself once. "Thank you, Lieutenant. My father served under you in Afghanistan." That caught me off guard. "What's his name?" "Senior Chief Daniel Mercer." I smiled immediately. "Mercer survived because of your evacuation order," the lieutenant said quietly. My family never forgot that. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my chest. Before I could answer, another officer approached. Then another. Across the ballroom, I noticed groups of military guests beginning to notice the gathering around my table. Recognition spread visibly now. A retired SEAL commander near the entrance suddenly stood upright. His eyes widened, and then everything changed. Chairs scraped backward across marble floors, one after another. Then dozens more, until 200 hardened SEALs rose to their feet all at once. The sound hit first. Not voices. Not applause. Just the violent scrape of chairs against marble as 200 men rose at the exact same moment. Every instinct inside me immediately recognized military discipline at work. The ballroom froze. Conversation stopped so abruptly that even the jazz band faltered into silence mid-song. I remained seated for half a second, stunned. Then a commander near the ballroom entrance squared his shoulders and bellowed with the kind of authority that once carried across aircraft carrier flight decks. "Admiral on deck." Every military guest snapped to attention. Some civilians stood awkwardly without understanding why. Others simply stared. I slowly rose from my chair. The room became utterly silent. I'd heard that command thousands of times in my life, on ships, at ceremonies, during inspections, in war zones where rank and order meant survival. But hearing it there in my sister's Charleston wedding reception while my parents stood speechless 20 feet away felt surreal. For one strange moment it was as though my two separate lives had collided. The daughter who was never enough, and the admiral who commanded fleets. The commander nearest me held his salute. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." A faint smile tugged at my mouth despite myself. "You always did anyway, Commander." A few quiet laughs rippled through the military crowd, easing the tension slightly. Then I recognized him fully. Commander Nate Holloway. Former SEAL team leader? Last time I'd seen him was overseas nearly 15 years earlier after a disastrous extraction operation in Kandahar. His hair was grayer now, face older, but his eyes carried the same sharp steadiness. "It's good to see you, Admiral Bennett," he said quietly. "You too, Nate." Behind him stood row after row of current and former SEALs officers, chiefs, enlisted sailors, Marines, and defense personnel. Some I recognized immediately. Others had aged enough that I needed a second glance. Yet every face carried the same expression. Respect. Real respect. Not the shallow kind people show powerful individuals because they want something. This was different. This came from shared hardship, shared sacrifice. Across the ballroom, I finally looked toward my parents. My mother's hand covered her mouth. My father stood perfectly still beside her, his face pale beneath the ballroom lights. He looked genuinely confused, as though he couldn't reconcile the daughter he'd spent decades dismissing with the reaction unfolding around him. Melanie looked overwhelmed, more than angry now. The groom Ethan leaned toward her, whispering something urgently while glancing at me with obvious astonishment. Then an older man approached through the crowd. Tall, silver-haired, expensive Navy suit. I recognized him immediately. Thomas Whitaker, former Navy officer turned defense executive worth more money than most small towns. Also Ethan's father. He stopped directly in front of me and extended his hand warmly. "Admiral Bennett," he said, "I had no idea you were Melanie's sister." "That makes two of us," I answered before I could stop myself. To my surprise, Whitaker laughed softly. "Well," he said, "this explains why half the military guests suddenly forgot there's a wedding happening." Even I smiled at that. Whitaker turned toward the room. "For those of you civilians wondering what's happening," he announced calmly, "you're looking at Rear Admiral Claire Bennett, one of the most respected operational leaders this country's produced in the last 20 years. Murmurs spread immediately. I felt my stomach tighten. I never enjoyed public praise. After enough years in leadership, attention becomes exhausting. But there was no stopping it now. A retired SEAL near the back raised his glass. "She brought our boys home." Another voice answered. "Damn right she did." Then another. "Saved my unit in Helmand." A man I barely recognized stepped forward slowly. His left leg carried a noticeable limp. When he spoke, emotion roughened his voice. "You wrote letters to every one of our families after Red River." The room quieted again. I remembered him then. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Dean. We'd lost 4 men during Operation Red River. Worst night of my career. Dean stopped directly in front of me. "You sat with my wife for 6 hours after they told us Tommy didn't make it," he said quietly. "Most commanders send paperwork. You stayed." I swallowed hard. Some memories never loosen their grip. "That's what leaders are supposed to do," I answered softly. "No, ma'am," Dean replied. "That's what good people do." For a moment I couldn't speak. Around us, even civilians seemed moved now. The room no longer felt judgmental. It felt human. And strangely enough, that made everything harder. Because standing there surrounded by all that respect, all I could think about was how badly I'd wanted even a fraction of it from my own family. Whitaker gently motioned toward the head table. "Admiral, would you honor us by joining the family seating?" Before I could answer, my father finally found his voice. "Yes," he said quickly. "Of course she should sit with family." The sudden change almost made me laugh. 2 hours earlier, he'd wanted me invisible. Now he looked desperate to claim me publicly. I walked toward the head table slowly. Guests parted instinctively to make room. Some shook my hand. Others thanked me for my service. One elderly woman touched my arm and whispered, "My grandson made it home because of women like you." I thanked her quietly. When I finally reached the table, my father wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother looked emotional enough to cry. Melanie stared at me carefully. Not with jealousy anymore. Something closer to confusion. As if she'd suddenly realized she never actually knew me. Dinner resumed awkwardly. Conversation slowly returned. But the energy in the ballroom had changed permanently. Now people approached our table constantly. Military officers. Business leaders. Politicians. All wanting to speak with me. My father sat quietly through most of it, listening while strangers described accomplishments he'd never bothered learning about. At one point, an older senator shook my hand firmly. "Your Gulf evacuation strategy saved American lives," he said. "Washington still talks about that operation." My father looked at me sharply. "You planned military evacuations?" I nodded once. "Yes, Dad." He stared down at the tablecloth. A long silence followed. Finally, almost quietly enough to miss, he asked, "Why didn't you ever tell us you were this important?" That question landed harder than any insult ever had. I looked at the man who'd spent 30 years reducing my entire life to works for the government. Then I answered honestly, "You never wanted to know." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my entire life, my father had absolutely nothing to say. After dinner, the reception finally settled back into something resembling a normal wedding. The jazz band resumed playing. Guests drifted toward the dance floor. Servers carried slices of wedding cake between tables, while the Charleston harbor shimmered black beyond the ballroom windows. But everywhere I walked, people kept stopping me. Former sailors, retired Marines, defense contractors, widows of servicemen. Each conversation carried pieces of a life I rarely spoke about outside military circles. A retired chief introduced me to his granddaughter attending Annapolis next year. One former corpsman hugged me so hard I thought my ribs might crack. Another man simply shook my hand silently with tears in his eyes. That one stayed with me. War leaves echoes in people, especially after enough years. Around 9 o'clock, I finally slipped outside for air. The noise of the ballroom faded behind me as I walked toward the marina beside the venue. Charleston Harbor stretched dark and calm beneath the moonlight. Boats rocked gently against wooden docks while warm coastal wind moved through the palmetto trees. For the first time all evening, I could breathe. I leaned against the railing and loosened one white glove slowly. "Mind if I join you, Admiral?" I turned and smiled faintly. Ramon Hayes approached carrying 2 glasses of bourbon. "About time you showed up," I said. "Traffic. That's your excuse for everything." He handed me a glass. Ramon had retired from the SEALs 6 years earlier after multiple surgeries finally forced him out. Even now, he moved carefully, favoring one knee during cold weather. We stood side by side, overlooking the water in comfortable silence. "You handled that circus pretty well," he finally said. "I've survived congressional hearings. Weddings are nothing." He laughed quietly. Then his expression softened. "You okay?" That question nearly broke me. Because underneath the polished uniform and decades of leadership training, part of me still felt emotionally raw from seeing my parents' faces inside that ballroom. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. Ramon nodded like he understood completely. "That's the trouble with family," he said. "Strangers can wound you. Family can convince you the wound belongs there." I stared across the harbor lights. "You know the ridiculous part, I'm 58 years old, and I still wanted my father to look proud of me. That never goes away." "Number?" "Nope." He took a sip of bourbon. "My old man hugged me once in his entire life. I remember the date better than my wedding anniversary." I laughed softly at that. Then footsteps approached behind us. I turned expecting another guest. Instead, it was Melanie. Still in her wedding gown. Still carrying that careful expression people wear when approaching emotional landmines. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Ramon immediately stepped back politely. "I'll give you ladies a minute." Once he disappeared toward the ballroom, Melanie joined me at the railing. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, she exhaled slowly. "I owe you an apology." I remained quiet. "When I asked you to remove your medals?" She looked down. "That was wrong." "It wasn't about the medals." "No," she admitted, "it wasn't." The harbor wind moved loose strands of hair across her face. "You know what's awful," she said quietly. I spent most of my life thinking Mom and Dad loved me more because I was somehow better than you. I looked at her carefully. But tonight I realized something. What? They never understood you enough to appreciate you. That hurt because it was true. Melanie's eyes glistened. You were always the brave one, Claire. I almost smiled. You say that now? No, I should have said it years ago. She leaned both hands against the railing beside me. When you left for Annapolis, Mom cried for a week. Dad kept saying you'd fail and come home. I remember. But every promotion you got after that? She shook her head slowly. It scared them. Why? Because you became someone bigger than the life they understood. I looked out toward the dark Atlantic beyond the harbor. Maybe she was right. Small-town Southern families sometimes know how to celebrate familiar success. Marriage. Children. Local respectability. But ambition that carries someone far away can feel threatening. Especially when it changes the family structure itself. Melanie touched my arm gently. For what it's worth, she whispered, I was always proud to tell people my sister was in the Navy. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. Thank you. We stood together quietly after that. For the first time in decades, the competition between us felt gone. Not healed completely, but softened. Then my mother appeared outside the ballroom doors. Her mascara had smudged slightly. She looked smaller somehow. Older. Claire, she said softly, could we talk? Melanie squeezed my hand once before walking away. My mother approached carefully like she feared I might disappear if she moved too quickly. I owe you an apology too, she said immediately. I stayed silent. She looked down at her hands. I didn't understand your life. I think maybe I chose the easier daughter. The honesty stunned me. Melanie needed me differently, she continued. You always seemed so strong. I let out a tired breath. That's the problem with strong daughters, Mom. People think they don't need kindness. Tears filled her eyes instantly. I never meant to hurt you. But you did. I know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me completely. I used to keep newspaper clippings about your promotions, she admitted quietly. Your father didn't know. I stared at her. What? They're in my dresser drawer at home. That image nearly shattered me. My mother secretly saving pieces of my life while pretending indifference for years. Why do families do this to each other? Why do people who love one another waste so much time withholding it? Before I could answer, another voice spoke behind us. Barbara. My father. He stood near the ballroom doors looking uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. My mother quietly touched my arm and walked back inside, leaving us alone. Dad approached slowly toward the marina railing. The harbor wind moved through his silver hair. For several seconds he simply stared out at the water beside me. Then he spoke without looking at me. I was drafted in 1967. That caught me completely off guard. You never told me that. No, his jaw tightened. Because your grandfather made some calls, kept me from serving. I frowned slightly. Dad swallowed hard. I spent my whole life pretending that didn't bother me. And suddenly pieces began fitting together. My father kept staring out across Charleston Harbor like the answer to his entire life might be floating somewhere in the dark water. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then he laughed once. Not happily. More like a man finally exhausted from carrying something too heavy for too long. Your grandfather knew people, he said quietly. Important people, county judges, politicians, men who owed favors. The wind moved softly against the marina docks beneath us. When my draft notice came, he paused. He made sure I never went to Vietnam. I studied him carefully. Growing up, my father had always carried himself like the toughest man in any room. Confident, certain, loud when necessary. But standing there now, he looked smaller somehow. Human. I always told people I had a knee problem, he continued. Truth is, I was healthy as a horse. I didn't interrupt. Back then, I convinced myself I was lucky. He swallowed. Then boys I grew up with started coming home in boxes. Pain roughened his voice on the last word. My best friend Tommy Walker died outside Da Nang in '68. We played football together since middle school. He rubbed his hands together slowly. I remember standing at his funeral while everybody called him a hero. His eyes remained fixed on the harbor, and all I could think was, That should have been me over there. The pieces finally clicked together inside my mind. His resentment. His discomfort around military service. His hostility toward my career. It had never truly been about me. It was shame. A lifetime of it. I spent 40 years trying not to think about Vietnam, he admitted quietly. Then my daughter joins the Navy and becomes everything I was too scared to become myself. I let out a slow breath. You could have told me. How he snapped suddenly. How exactly was I supposed to say that? The old temper flashed briefly before fading again. I didn't even know how to admit it to myself. Silence settled between us. Somewhere behind us inside the ballroom, guests laughed while the band played old Frank Sinatra songs. Normal life continuing. Meanwhile, my father stood unraveling decades of buried guilt beside a dark marina. I thought if I minimized your career, he whispered, maybe I wouldn't feel so ashamed of mine. That one hurt. Not because it was cruel. Because it was honest. I leaned both hands against the railing. You know what's strange, Dad?
What?
I spent my entire life thinking you were disappointed in me. He looked at me finally then. Deep regret filled his face. Claire, he said quietly, I never stopped being proud of you. The words hit me so hard I nearly looked away. Because they arrived about 30 years too late. You had a funny way of showing it. I know. He nodded immediately. I know that now. For a moment I saw not the intimidating father from my childhood, but simply an old man carrying regrets he could no longer outrun. Age does that to people. Eventually life strips away enough pride that honesty becomes easier than pretending. Dad cleared his throat roughly. When you left for Annapolis, I told everybody you'd quit after one semester. I smiled faintly. I remember. But every time you proved me wrong, he shook his head slowly, I'd secretly brag about you at work. I blinked. What? Oh, I never told you. He gave a weak laugh. But I kept your newspaper articles in my desk drawer. Emotion caught unexpectedly in my chest. All those years. All those wasted years. I didn't understand your world, he admitted. Truth is, I think it scared me. I stared out at the water again. When I commanded my first destroyer, I said softly, I was terrified every single day for 6 months. Dad looked surprised. You. Yes, me? You never looked scared. That's leadership. A small smile touched his face for the first time all evening. Then he asked quietly, did it cost you a lot, the Navy? That question carried more compassion than anything he'd asked me in years. I thought about David. The miscarriage during deployment. Missed anniversaries. Buried friends. The loneliness of command. Yes, I answered honestly, it cost a lot. Dad nodded slowly like he finally understood something important. You know, he said your mother used to sit by the television during Desert Storm waiting for updates. Pretended she wasn't worried. He smiled faintly, but every time your name came on screen she'd cry afterward. I looked down at my white gloves resting against the railing. Families are complicated creatures. Sometimes love hides beneath layers of fear, pride, resentment, and misunderstanding, until nobody remembers how to express it properly anymore. Around 10:30 guests began leaving the reception. The music softened. Valets brought cars around front. Inside the ballroom, staff cleared champagne glasses while Melanie and Ethan prepared for their final send-off. Dad shifted awkwardly beside me. I know I can't fix everything tonight. No, I agreed gently, you can't. He nodded once. But I'd like to try. For the first time in decades, I believed him. The next morning I woke before sunrise out of habit. My hotel room overlooked Charleston Harbor, glowing pale gold beneath early morning light. Cargo ships moved slowly across the water while gulls circled above the docks. I dressed quietly in civilian clothes for the drive back to Norfolk. No uniform today. Just jeans, loafers, and a navy sweater. By 7 o'clock I was downstairs checking out when the front desk clerk smiled nervously. There's someone waiting for you outside, Admiral Bennett. I stepped through the hotel doors, expecting perhaps Ramon. Instead, my father stood beside his old Buick holding a worn cardboard box. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he held the box toward me awkwardly. Your mother wanted you to have these. I opened it carefully. Inside sat dozens of letters. My letters. Every letter I'd mailed home from Annapolis during my academy years. Some still carried creases from being folded and unfolded repeatedly. My throat tightened instantly. "She kept all of them," I whispered. Dad nodded. "I read them last night." He looked exhausted, older than I'd ever seen him. Then he reached into the box and pulled out one envelope carefully. There was one line. His voice cracked slightly. One line I can't stop thinking about. He handed me the letter. I recognized my own 18-year-old handwriting immediately. Dad swallowed hard. "You wrote..." He paused. "I hope someday Dad will finally be proud of me." Emotion hit both of us at once. His eyes reddened visibly. "I was proud the whole time," he said quietly. "I just didn't know how to say it." I looked at the old man standing before me. And for the first time in my life, I believed him. Melanie arrived a few minutes later carrying coffee and breakfast sandwiches for the drive. She hugged me tightly before I left. "No more disappearing for months at a time," she warned gently. "I'll try." As I pulled onto the highway north, Charleston disappeared slowly behind me beneath soft Carolina morning light. And somewhere between the harbor and the interstate, I realized something unexpected. The greatest victory of my life wasn't becoming an admiral. It was finally understanding I no longer needed anyone's permission to know my own worth. A few hours later, I stopped at a small airport cafe near Norfolk. While waiting for coffee, a nervous young woman in Navy recruit sweats recognized me immediately. Her eyes widened. "Admiral Bennett." I smiled softly. "That's me." The young recruit straightened awkwardly and offered an uncertain salute. I returned it warmly. And suddenly, for the first time in years, the future felt lighter than the past. If this story touched something in your heart, maybe share it with someone who spent too many years feeling unseen. And if you've ever struggled to hear the words, "I'm proud of you," remember this. Sometimes people love us long before they learn how to say it. Thank you for listening. The British man looked me straight in the eye, glanced down at the tarnished brass key in my hand, and said words that made my knees feel weak. "Miss Carter, we've been looking for that key for 47 years. For a moment, neither of us moved. The Wyoming wind rattled the porch swing behind me. A pickup truck rolled down the county road. Everything looked perfectly normal, yet somehow my entire life had just tilted sideways. I remember staring at him and thinking he had the wrong house, the wrong woman, the wrong key, because 2 weeks earlier everyone in my family had laughed when I inherited it, including my own father. To understand how I ended up standing on my porch at 62 years old with a stranger from England asking about a key that supposedly mattered to Buckingham Palace, I need to go back to the day my grandfather died. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was born and raised outside Sheridan, Wyoming. If you've lived in ranch country, you know how families like ours work. Land isn't just property. It's identity. It's history. It's pride. And sometimes it's trouble. My grandfather, Walter Carter, was the kind of man people respected. A Korean War veteran. A rancher. A man who shook your hand firmly and looked you in the eye. He wasn't rich by New York standards, but around our county he had done very well. He owned thousands of acres of land. He had cattle, investments, and a small agricultural supply company that had grown steadily over the years. People assumed Grandpa would leave behind a fortune. They were right. When he passed away at 89, the entire family showed up. Not just for grief. If we're being honest, many of them showed up for the will. I hate saying that. But age teaches you to stop pretending. The funeral was held on a bright autumn morning. The church was full. Veterans sat in the front rows. Neighbors filled the pews. People told stories about Grandpa helping them during droughts, lending equipment when crops failed, and quietly paying bills for families who were struggling. That was Walter Carter. He never bragged. Most of the good things he did were discovered after he was gone. I sat quietly through the service. My father, Richard Carter, sat beside my brother, Stephen. Neither spoke much to me. That wasn't unusual. We weren't exactly close. For most of my life, I had been the overlooked child. Stephen was the golden boy, the future businessman, the son who could do no wrong. I was simply Evelyn, the daughter who stayed nearby, the daughter who helped, the daughter who was expected to understand. 3 days after the funeral, we gathered at the attorney's office. The atmosphere felt strange. Too polite. Too tense. Everyone waiting for their turn. Everyone pretending they weren't calculating numbers in their heads. The attorney, Harold Benson, had known Grandpa for decades. His face was serious as he opened the file. Walter wanted his wishes followed exactly as written. My father nodded. Stephen crossed his arms confidently. I sat quietly. Then the reading began. The ranch went to my father. All 3,000 acres, every pasture, every building, every piece of equipment. Dad looked satisfied. Not emotional, satisfied. Next came the agricultural company. That went entirely to Stephen. My brother tried to hide his smile. He failed. The company had been earning excellent money for years. Everyone knew it. Various relatives received cash inheritances, savings accounts, certificates, investments. By the time the attorney reached my name, I honestly wasn't expecting much. Maybe some money, maybe a small account, maybe Grandpa's old truck. Instead, Harold paused. He opened a separate envelope. Then he looked directly at me. Evelyn. His voice softened. Your grandfather left you this. He handed me a small wooden box. That's all. Just a box. The room became very quiet. I opened it. Inside was an old brass key. Nothing else. No diamonds. No stock certificates. No deeds. Just a key. Underneath it sat a folded, handwritten note. I opened the note. The handwriting was unmistakably Grandpa's. It said, "One day someone will come asking for this. Listen before you judge. Love." Grandpa! I read it twice, then a third time. I had absolutely no idea what it meant. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then Stephen laughed. Actually laughed. That's it. A few relatives chuckled. My father shook his head. Well, Walter always did enjoy mysteries. More laughter. Stephen leaned back in his chair. Looks like Grandpa left the treasure hunt to Evelyn. The room erupted again. I forced a smile. What else could I do? But the truth was their laughter hurt. Not because of the money. At 62, I wasn't chasing fortunes. I owned my home. I paid my bills. I lived comfortably. What hurt was the message everyone immediately assumed. That I wasn't important enough to inherit anything meaningful. That after years of helping Grandpa, this was somehow all I deserved. Then Dad delivered the line I would never forget. He pointed toward the box. Looks like you got the junk. More laughter. Oh, I didn't argue. I simply closed the box, thanked the attorney, and went home. The drive took nearly 40 minutes. The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly around me. Golden grass, blue sky, the Bighorn Mountains in the distance. Normally that view calmed me. Not that day. That day I kept hearing their voices, their laughter, their assumptions. I thought about all the afternoons I'd spent helping Grandpa after Grandma died. Doctor appointments, groceries, hospital visits, hours sitting on his porch drinking coffee, listening to stories. None of that had been done for money. But suddenly I felt foolish. Maybe they were right. Maybe Grandpa had simply given me a sentimental keepsake. Maybe there was no deeper meaning. Over the next 2 weeks, life settled down. Dad focused on the ranch. Stephen celebrated his new ownership of the company. Family members talked endlessly about inheritances. The key sat on my kitchen table. Sometimes I'd pick it up, study it, turn it over. It looked old, heavy. The brass was worn smooth in places. No markings, no clues, just a key. And a strange note. One day someone will come asking for this. Listen before you judge. The words stayed with me. Then came the knock. A Thursday afternoon, about 3 o'clock. I opened my front door. A black luxury sedan sat in my driveway. A gray-haired gentleman stood on my porch wearing a dark suit. Polite, professional, British. Miss Evelyn Carter? Yes. He offered a business card. I am Malcolm Reed. I glanced at the card, then back at him. I believe he said carefully, "You may possess an item that has been missing since 1979. My stomach tightened. He looked past me toward the house, then back into my eyes. Specifically, he said an old brass key. The world suddenly felt very quiet. I slowly reached into my pocket, pulled out the key. His expression changed instantly. Relief, disbelief, almost gratitude. Then he whispered the sentence that would change everything. "Miss Carter, we've been looking for that key for 47 years. I stood frozen on my front porch. The brass key suddenly felt heavier in my hand. The British gentleman, Malcolm Reed, was staring at it as if he'd just found a missing piece of history. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I managed to ask the obvious question. "What exactly are you talking about?" His expression softened. "May I come inside, Miss Carter?" Every warning bell in my head started ringing. At 62 years old, I'd learned not to trust strangers, especially strangers arriving in expensive foreign cars talking about lost keys. "I think you'd better explain first." He nodded respectfully. "Fair enough." Then he reached into a leather briefcase. What he pulled out next changed everything. The first item was a photograph, An old black and white photograph. The edges were yellowed with age. Two young men stood side by side in military uniforms. One of them was my grandfather. I recognized him instantly despite the decades. The broad shoulders, the strong jaw, the calm eyes. The other man was someone I'd never seen before. Young, British, elegant even in military clothing. "Who is that?" I asked. Malcolm looked down at the photo. His name was Edward Harrington. The name meant nothing to me, at least not yet. 10 minutes later, we were sitting at my kitchen table. Coffee sat untouched between us. The key rested in the center. Malcolm carefully organized a stack of documents. The more papers he revealed, the less I believed this was some kind of scam. Military records, photographs, letters, government seals, historical archives. Everything looked authentic. Miss Carter, Malcolm began. "Your grandfather was not merely a rancher." I laughed softly. "I know that. He was a veteran." Malcolm nodded. "Yes. But what most people don't know is that during the Korean War, he became involved in an incident that remained confidential for decades." I leaned back in my chair. This was becoming stranger by the minute. "What kind of incident?" He opened another folder. Inside was a military report. Several sections had clearly been declassified years earlier. One name appeared repeatedly. Walter Carter. My grandfather. Malcolm began telling a story I had never heard before. In 1952, Grandpa's unit had been assigned to support a multinational operation near the Korean border. Among the personnel present was a young British diplomatic courier named Edward Harrington. Officially, Harrington wasn't supposed to be anywhere near active combat zones. Unofficially, he was carrying highly sensitive diplomatic materials. One evening, their convoy came under attack. Several vehicles were destroyed. Communications were cut. Chaos erupted. According to witness accounts, Harrington became trapped in a damaged transport truck. Enemy fire pinned everyone down. Several soldiers attempted a rescue. None could reach him. Then Walter Carter volunteered. My grandfather. The quiet rancher I knew. The man who spent mornings feeding cattle and afternoons drinking coffee on his porch. That man. Malcolm slid another document toward me. I stared at the report. The details made my heart race. Walter Carter had crossed nearly 80 yards of open ground under fire. Alone. He reached the truck, freed Harrington, carried him to safety, then returned to help evacuate 2 wounded soldiers. The operation saved multiple lives, including Harrington's. I read the report twice, then a third time. Grandpa never told me any of this. Malcolm smiled. According to everyone who knew him, he rarely spoke about the war. That was true. Whenever people asked questions, Grandpa usually changed the subject. I had always assumed painful memories were the reason. Now I wondered what else he had been keeping to himself. After the war, Malcolm continued, Mr. Harrington returned to Britain. What happened to him? He entered government service. Malcolm paused. Eventually, he became a trusted advisor to several members of the royal household. I blinked. The royal household. Yes. I suddenly understood why Buckingham Palace had become involved. At least partly. But I still didn't understand the key. Malcolm opened another folder. This one contained letters. Dozens of letters. Many handwritten. Some signed by Harrington. Others by my grandfather. The correspondence stretched across decades. The 2 men had remained friends. Close friends. I felt a lump forming in my throat. Grandpa had written letters to this man for nearly 40 years. Yet I had never heard his name. The realization felt strangely sad. Even after all those years together, parts of Grandpa's life had remained completely hidden. Then Malcolm finally addressed the key. In 1979, he said Mr. Harrington found himself responsible for safeguarding certain materials. What kind of materials? Historical documents. Important documents, extremely important. His tone made me sit straighter. Important enough that they needed to disappear temporarily. I frowned. Disappear. Malcolm nodded. There were concerns regarding theft and unauthorized access. Nothing criminal, nothing scandalous. Simply sensitive historical records whose protection was considered essential. He pointed toward the brass key. Mr. Harrington entrusted access to those materials to exactly one person. I already knew the answer. My grandfather. Yes. The room felt impossibly quiet. Outside, a meadowlark landed near the fence. A tractor hummed somewhere in the distance. Ordinary Wyoming sounds. Meanwhile, my grandfather's life was becoming less ordinary by the minute. Why him? Malcolm smiled. Because your grandfather had already proven he could be trusted with another man's life. That answer hit me harder than I expected. Not because it sounded dramatic, because it sounded exactly like Grandpa. Dependable, steady, trustworthy. The qualities nobody celebrates until they desperately need them. The arrangement was simple, Malcolm continued. A secure deposit container was established. A safety deposit box, similar though considerably more secure. And Grandpa got the key. Yes, the only key. Malcolm hesitated, then nodded. The only key. I stared at the brass object resting on my table. Suddenly it no longer looked ordinary. 47 years. 47 years people had searched for it. Yet it had been sitting in my grandfather's house all along. What happened? Malcolm sighed. Mr. Harrington died unexpectedly in the early 1980s. Before retrieving the documents. Correct. Didn't anyone know where the key was? Number. I looked down. Because Grandpa never told anyone. Precisely. The search began. Records were examined. Properties investigated. Former associates interviewed. Nothing. The key had vanished. At least that's what everyone believed. I remembered the note. One day someone will come asking for this. Listen before you judge. A chill ran through me. Grandpa had known. Somehow he had known. Not when. Not who. But eventually someone would come. And now someone had. Why give it to me? I asked quietly. Why not Dad? Why not my brother? Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead he opened one final envelope. Inside was a short handwritten statement. Signed by Walter Carter, my grandfather. Malcolm slid it across the table. My hands trembled as I read. If this key is ever needed, give it to Evelyn. She listens. She keeps her word. And she understands that some things matter more than money. I couldn't speak. For a moment, all I could see was Grandpa sitting on his porch, coffee in one hand, sunset over the ranch, watching quietly while everyone else talked. Watching. Knowing. Planning. Trusting. Me. The tears came before I could stop them. Not because of the mystery. Not because of the key. Because after a lifetime of feeling overlooked, I finally understood something. Grandpa had seen me. The real me. All along. Malcolm allowed me a few moments to compose myself. Then he spoke carefully. There is one final thing you should know. I wiped my eyes. What is it? The container still exists. I stared at him. The documents are still there. Yes. And the key opens it. Yes. My pulse quickened. What's inside? For the first time since arriving, Malcolm looked genuinely excited. Miss Carter, he said quietly, the contents are believed to be worth several $1 million. And just like that, the inheritance everyone had laughed at became the most valuable thing my grandfather had ever left behind. The funny thing about money is that it can change people's attitudes faster than almost anything else. For 2 weeks, I had been the woman who inherited junk. The forgotten daughter. The disappointment. The one who got a brass key while everyone else received land businesses and bank accounts. Then Malcolm Reed told me the contents connected to that key might be worth millions. Within 48 hours, everything changed. And not for the better. The first person to call was my brother. Stephen. That alone told me something was wrong. My brother rarely called unless he needed something. The phone rang while I was drinking coffee on my back porch. I almost didn't answer. Almost. Hello, Evelyn. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. That should have been my first warning. How are you doing? I nearly laughed. In 62 years, I couldn't remember Stephen ever opening a conversation by asking how I was doing. I'm fine. Good. An awkward pause followed. Then he finally arrived at the real reason for the call. I heard you had a visitor from England. There it was. The reason. Not concern. Not family. Curiosity. Or more accurately, greed. News travels quickly in Wyoming, especially in small towns. Apparently someone had seen Malcolm's black sedan parked outside my house. Someone mentioned it at a diner. Someone else mentioned Buckingham Palace. Within a day, half the county was talking. Within 2 days, my family knew. Who told you? I asked. Oh, people talk. Of course they did. Stephen lowered his voice. So what's the story? Nothing finalized. Come on, Evelyn. I remained silent. He tried a different approach. We're family. The words irritated me more than they should have. Because whenever people suddenly start saying, we're family, it usually means they want something. The conversation lasted another 10 minutes. By the end of it, Stephen had asked at least 12 questions. How valuable were the documents? Would there be a reward? Did the British government offer compensation? Would ownership transfer? Could family members be included? I answered almost none of them. After we hung up, I sat quietly on the porch. The mountains looked beautiful in the morning sunlight. Yet something felt wrong. For years, Stephen barely showed interest in my life. Now he couldn't stop calling. Dad arrived 3 days later, unannounced. I saw his truck pull into the driveway shortly after lunch. He stepped out carrying the same confident expression he'd worn most of his life, the expression of a man accustomed to being in charge. I invited him inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Malcolm had explained everything. Dad got straight to the point. Stephen says there's money involved. No greeting, no small talk, just money. I folded my hands. We don't know that yet, but there might be. Possibly. He nodded thoughtfully, then leaned forward. Well, whatever happens, we should handle it together. I almost smiled, not because the suggestion was unreasonable, because it arrived about 2 weeks too late. Together, I asked. Of course. Like when everyone laughed at Grandpa's gift. Dad looked uncomfortable. Nobody meant anything by that. I remembered every word, every laugh, every smirk, especially his. Looks like you got the junk. Funny how quickly junk becomes important when someone thinks it might be valuable. Dad shifted in his chair. Let's not dwell on that. But I wanted to dwell on it. Not out of anger, out of honesty. Older people learn something important. Pretending something never happened doesn't heal anything. Why not, I asked. You laughed too. His eyes dropped briefly. The silence that followed lasted several seconds, long enough for both of us to know I was right. For the next hour, Dad talked about family unity, family responsibility, family interests. The word family appeared so often it almost lost meaning. Yet one thing was noticeably absent. An apology. Not once did he say he was sorry. Not once did he admit they had treated me poorly. Instead, he spoke as though the situation naturally belonged to everyone, as though Grandpa's explicit decision somehow didn't matter anymore. When he finally left, I felt exhausted. Not angry. Just tired. Ooh. The following week brought more surprises. Cousins started calling. Aunts I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted lunch. People became interested in my schedule, interested in my plans, interested in my relationship with Malcolm. I felt like a woman who had accidentally won the lottery. Everyone suddenly remembered my phone number. Meanwhile, Malcolm continued his investigation. Several lengthy phone calls followed. Documents moved between historians, attorneys, and archivists. Eventually, he called with major news. The container has been located. I nearly dropped the phone. What? The vault. My heart started racing. You found it? Yes. Where? A private banking facility in London. I sat down immediately. After all these years, after decades, the container still existed. Waiting. Locked. Untouched. Oh. A week later, Malcolm returned to Wyoming, this time carrying additional documentation. Everything was arranged. Travel plans, security procedures, legal paperwork, historical verification. The amount of preparation astonished me. Clearly, this wasn't some forgotten storage box. This mattered. A great deal. Then came the discovery that shocked me most. The key wasn't merely symbolic. It genuinely worked. Without it, the container could not legally be accessed through the original agreement. My grandfather had protected access for nearly half a century, simply by keeping a promise nobody else even knew existed. The closer we moved toward opening the container, the more pressure arrived from my family. Stephen called almost daily. Dad began stopping by regularly. Their questions became increasingly specific. How much do you think it's worth? Have they offered compensation? Will ownership be shared? What percentage belongs to the family? One evening, Stephen finally said what he'd been thinking all along. You know, Grandpa would have wanted us all to benefit. I almost laughed, because we both knew that wasn't true. Grandpa had already made his decision. Clearly, deliberately, legally, and Stephen hated it. A few days later, Malcolm and I participated in a conference call with historians in London. That's when everything changed again. The experts had completed preliminary research. The contents weren't merely valuable. They were historically significant. Potentially very significant. Documents connected to post-war diplomacy. Personal correspondence. Military records. Private journals. Materials believed lost for decades. I sat silently while they discussed preservation, authentication, and historical importance. The money suddenly felt secondary. What mattered was the story, the history, the truth. Mind. Then one historian made a comment I'll never forget. Your grandfather may have preserved one of the most important privately held collections we've encountered in years. I stared out my window. The Wyoming sunset was turning the sky orange. Grandpa would have hated all this attention. He wasn't that kind of man. Yet somehow the truth was finally catching up with him. 3 days later, another phone call arrived. This one from Malcolm. His voice sounded different. Excited. Miss Carter? Yes. We've completed a preliminary review of several inventory records. And you should know something before the story becomes public. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. What story? The story of Walter Carter. I sat forward. What about it? There was a brief pause. Then Malcolm said the words that would soon turn my grandfather into national news. A major American newspaper wants exclusive rights to publish the account of his wartime actions. I felt my breath catch, because for the first time I realized this was no longer about money. It was about legacy. And once the truth came out, everyone, including my father and brother, would finally learn who Walter Carter had really been. The first newspaper article appeared on a Sunday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table wearing an old flannel robe and drinking coffee when my phone started vibrating. By the third call, I knew something unusual had happened. By the 10th, I knew my life had changed again. The article wasn't about the mysterious key. It wasn't about Buckingham Palace. And it wasn't about hidden documents worth millions. It was about Walter Carter, my grandfather, the man almost everyone thought they knew, the man almost nobody truly understood. The reporter had spent weeks verifying military records, interviewing historians, and examining the newly recovered correspondence. The story painted a picture of a man far different from the quiet rancher most people remembered. For decades, Grandpa had carried extraordinary experiences without talking about them. The article detailed his actions during the Korean War, his rescue of Edward Harrington, the risks he took, the lives he saved, the trust he earned, the promises he kept, and perhaps most importantly, the fact that he had never used any of it to seek recognition. That part touched people, especially older Americans, people who came from generations that believed service spoke louder than self-promotion. By noon, the article had spread far beyond Wyoming. Veterans organizations began sharing it. Military history groups picked it up. Local television stations called. Radio hosts wanted interviews. Historians requested access to additional records. I watched it happen from my little kitchen in disbelief. For nearly 30 years after Grandma died, Grandpa had spent most mornings feeding cattle and fixing fences. Now people across the country were learning his name. Part of me wished he were alive to see it. Another part knew he would have hated every second of the attention. The first interview request arrived that afternoon. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my favorite thing. But Malcolm encouraged me. Your grandfather's story deserves to be told. So I agreed. The interview took place over the phone. The reporter asked thoughtful questions. Not sensational questions, human questions. What kind of man was Walter Carter? I smiled. Dependable. The answer surprised her. That's the first word that comes to mind. Absolutely. Because heroism sounds exciting. Dependability sounds ordinary. Yet when life becomes difficult, dependable people are the ones who save you. Grandpa understood that. Over the following weeks, interest continued growing. Newspapers published follow-up stories. Military historians uncovered additional records. Former service members contacted reporters with memories passed down through their families. Every new detail added another piece to the puzzle. The quiet old rancher from Wyoming gradually became something larger, a symbol of a generation that served without demanding applause. And then something unexpected happened. People started asking questions about my father. Not cruel questions, natural ones, questions that came from comparing his life to Grandpa's. Questions Dad clearly wasn't prepared to answer. For decades, he had been known as Walter Carter's son, the heir to the ranch, the public face of the family business. Now reporters wanted to know more about Walter himself. And suddenly Dad wasn't standing in the spotlight anymore. He was standing beside it. I didn't enjoy watching him struggle. Despite everything that had happened, he was still my father. But I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. For years, he'd enjoyed the respect associated with Grandpa's reputation. Now people wanted to know who had actually built that reputation. The answer wasn't Richard Carter. It was Walter. The truth wasn't humiliating him. The truth was simply removing the illusion. Stephen struggled even more. The agricultural company he'd inherited wasn't doing as well as everyone assumed. That fact gradually became obvious. Several poor business decisions had begun catching up with him. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to create problems. Employees started comparing his leadership to Grandpa's. Customers did the same. Investors noticed. And comparisons rarely favored Stephen. One evening he called me. For once he didn't sound confident. He sounded tired. "You enjoying this?" The question caught me off guard. Enjoying what? All of it. I knew exactly what he meant. The attention, the interviews, the recognition, the sudden shift in family dynamics. Number. There was silence. Then he laughed bitterly. "Come on, Evelyn. I'm serious. People treat you differently now." I stared out my kitchen window. The sun was setting behind the mountains. "That's not my fault." Number. His voice softened. "I guess it isn't." After we hung up, I thought about revenge. Not dramatic movie revenge. Real revenge. The kind people secretly dream about after years of being overlooked. Years of disrespect. Years of feeling invisible. I realized something surprising. I wasn't getting revenge. Not really. Because I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't exposing secrets. I wasn't humiliating anyone. I wasn't attacking my father or brother. I was simply telling the truth whenever someone asked. And somehow the truth was proving far more powerful than anger. Thought. One afternoon, a television producer asked me a question during an interview. "What do you think your grandfather would want people to remember?" I answered without hesitation. "That character matters more than recognition." The producer nodded. "Can you explain? Most people spend their lives trying to be noticed." I smiled. My grandfather spent his life trying to do the right thing whether anyone noticed or not. The clip aired nationally. People responded strongly. Letters arrived. Emails. Messages from veterans. Messages from families. Messages from people who saw pieces of their own parents and grandparents in Walter Carter. The greatest irony was that Grandpa finally received recognition precisely because he never chased it. That lesson stayed with me, especially during difficult conversations with family. Then came another major development. An invitation. Official. Formal. Unexpected. Malcolm personally delivered it. We sat in my living room while he carefully removed a cream-colored envelope from his briefcase. The paper looked expensive. The seal looked important. My stomach immediately tightened. "What is that?" Malcolm smiled. "I believe you'll want to read it." I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation to London. Representatives connected to the royal household wished to recognize Walter Carter's contribution to preserving historically significant materials and honoring commitments made decades earlier. I read it twice, then a third time. Surely I was misunderstanding something. Are they inviting me? Yes. To England? Yes. Why? Malcolm's smile widened. Because your grandfather's story has reached people who believe it deserves proper recognition. For several moments, I simply stared at the invitation. I had never traveled overseas. Not once. At 62 years old, my life had been spent mostly between Wyoming, Montana, and a handful of neighboring states. Now London was suddenly becoming real. The idea felt overwhelming. Exciting. Terrifying. Then Malcolm said something that made my pulse quicken. "This is only the beginning." "What does that mean?" He leaned back comfortably. "The recovered collection contains more than historical documents." I frowned. "What else is there?" "A great many things we're still cataloging." And Malcolm's expression became thoughtful. "We recently discovered evidence suggesting your grandfather left behind one final message." A chill ran through me. One final message. Yes? A letter. I swallowed hard. A letter for who? Malcolm looked directly at me. For you. And for the first time since this extraordinary journey began, I realized Grandpa's greatest secret might still be waiting for me on the other side of the Atlantic. At 62 years old, I took my first trip across the Atlantic. If you'd told me 6 months earlier that I'd be flying to London because of a secret my grandfather had carried for nearly half a century, I would have laughed. Not because it sounded impossible, because my life had always been ordinary. And I had learned long ago that ordinary people rarely find themselves at the center of extraordinary stories. Yet there I was, sitting by an airplane window, watching Wyoming disappear beneath the clouds, holding Grandpa's brass key in my purse. The same key my family had mocked. The same key that had somehow unlocked a door into a life I never knew he had lived. The flight was long enough to think, long enough to remember. I spent hours staring out the window, replaying memories of Grandpa. The small things, the important things, the things nobody writes newspaper articles about. The way he always carried peppermints in his shirt pocket. The way he tipped his hat to strangers. The way he listened more than he talked. For weeks, the world had been celebrating his heroism. But those weren't the moments I missed. I missed the quiet moments, the human moments, the grandfather moments. Oh, when the plane landed, London felt like another world. The buildings, the accents, the history. Even the air felt different. Malcolm met me at the airport. "Welcome to England, Miss Carter." I smiled. "Please call me Evelyn. Only if you call me Malcolm. Deal." For the first time since we'd met, neither of us was talking about documents, historians, or legal agreements. We were simply two older people sharing a remarkable journey. The next several days passed in a blur. Meetings, archives, historical reviews, tours of facilities connected to the recovered collection. Everywhere we went, people treated Grandpa's story with enormous respect. That mattered to me. Because the more I learned, the more I realized this was never about money. It was about trust. A promise made. A promise kept. Across generations. Across oceans. Across nearly 50 years. So, one afternoon, Malcolm escorted me to a private archive facility. Several historians were waiting. The recovered materials had been carefully cataloged and preserved. I stood before display tables covered with documents. Letters, journals, military records, photographs. Some hadn't been seen in decades. One historian handed me a pair of white gloves. "Take your time." I nodded, then carefully lifted the first journal. My grandfather's handwriting stared back at me. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It felt as though he had suddenly stepped back into the room. I spent hours reading. Page after page. Memory after memory. Stories he'd never shared. Experiences he'd never discussed. Thoughts he'd kept private. Some entries described wartime events. Others described life back in Wyoming. Many mentioned family, including me. That surprised me most. I found references to birthdays, conversations, visits, simple moments I barely remembered. Yet Grandpa had recorded them, preserved them, valued them, far more than I ever realized. The next morning brought the ceremony. The event wasn't enormous. It wasn't designed for television. It wasn't some grand spectacle. Instead, it felt dignified, respectful, personal. Exactly the kind of recognition Grandpa would have preferred. Representatives from several institutions attended. Military historians, archivists, officials connected to the royal household. A handful of invited guests. Nothing flashy. Nothing excessive. Just gratitude. When they spoke about Walter Carter, they didn't focus on money, or fame, or headlines. They focused on character, integrity, trust. The qualities that had allowed one promise to survive for 47 years. As I listened, I felt proud. Not because Grandpa was being honored, because the values he lived by were being honored. In a world that often celebrates wealth and status, people were celebrating decency. That felt important. Near the end of the ceremony, a presentation took place. A commemorative medal, posthumously awarded, presented in recognition of service courage and stewardship. When they handed it to me, emotion nearly overwhelmed me. I wished Grandpa could have accepted it himself. He deserved that moment. Not me. Him. Always him. Later that afternoon, Malcolm approached me carrying a small archival box. His expression immediately caught my attention. "What is it?" "I believe we've found the item I mentioned." My pulse quickened. "The letter?" He nodded. "The letter." For a moment I couldn't move. Everything else suddenly faded away. The ceremony. The recognition. The historical discoveries. All of it. Only one thing mattered. A final message from Grandpa. We found a quiet room. No reporters. No historians. Just Malcolm and me. He placed the letter gently in front of me. The envelope was yellowed with age. My name appeared on the front, written in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. Evelyn. Nothing more. Just Evelyn. Tears immediately filled my eyes. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet. I unfolded it carefully. Then I began to read. The room disappeared. The years disappeared. For a little while, it was just me and Grandpa. One final conversation. The letter wasn't long, but every word mattered. He explained why he'd chosen me. Not because I was smarter. Not because I was more successful. Not because I was family. He chose me because I listened. Because I cared for people. Because I understood things that couldn't be measured in dollars. Then I reached the sentence that broke me. The sentence I still remember word for word. The key was never the treasure. The treasure was knowing who you are when nobody believes in you. I stopped reading. The tears came instantly. Harder than they had at his funeral. Harder than they had during the inheritance. Harder than they had during the ceremony. Because suddenly everything made sense. The ranch wasn't the point. The company wasn't the point. The documents weren't the point. Even the key wasn't the point. The lesson was the point. Grandpa had spent years watching people measure worth through ownership, land, money, titles, success. Meanwhile, he had been measuring something entirely different. Character, patience, loyalty, integrity. For most of my life, I'd quietly wondered whether being overlooked meant being less valuable. The letter answered that question forever. Number? Absolutely not. The people who shout the loudest aren't always the strongest. The people who receive the most attention aren't always the most important. Sometimes the people changing lives are the ones nobody notices. Grandpa had noticed. That was enough. That evening I sat alone in my hotel room overlooking the city lights of London. The letter rested beside me. The medal sat nearby. For the first time in weeks I felt peace. Real peace. Not excitement. Not vindication. Peace. Then my phone rang. The number was from Wyoming. I answered immediately. And what I heard next made my heart sink. My father had suffered a serious health scare, and suddenly everything that had happened between us felt far less important. The flight home felt completely different from the flight to London. When I had left Wyoming, my mind had been full of questions. Now it was full of answers. The letter from Grandpa rested safely inside my carry-on bag. I must have read it 20 times during the trip. Maybe more. Every time I read it, another piece of my life seemed to fall into place. The key was never the treasure. The treasure was knowing who you are when nobody believes in you. Those words stayed with me all the way across the Atlantic. But as comforting as they were, they couldn't stop me from worrying about my father. The moment I landed in Wyoming, I drove straight from the airport to the hospital. The familiar roads seemed different somehow. Maybe because I had changed. Maybe because life had changed. Or maybe because age teaches you that some things matter less than you thought they did. For weeks, I had watched my father and brother reveal sides of themselves I didn't like. I had every reason to feel resentful. Yet as I parked outside the hospital, none of that seemed important. When someone you love is sick, old arguments suddenly lose their power. Dad looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing I noticed. For most of my life, Richard Carter had seemed larger than life. Strong, confident, certain. The kind of man who walked into every room expecting to be heard. Now he looked tired, fragile, older. For the first time, I wasn't looking at my father. I was looking at an 84-year-old man. There is a difference. His eyes opened when I entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a weak smile. You made it home. Of course I did. I pulled a chair beside his bed. The machines hummed softly around us. Neither of us seemed to know where to begin. Finally, Dad looked toward the window. I saw the ceremony. I nodded. A friend recorded it. Another silence followed. Then he surprised me. I was proud of him. Grandpa! Yes. His voice cracked slightly. I always was. For the next hour, we talked more honestly than we had in decades. Not because one of us suddenly became wiser. Because age had finally removed our excuses. There wasn't enough time left for pretending. Dad stared at the blanket covering his legs. You want to know something ugly? I didn't answer. I simply listened. Just like Grandpa had taught me. I was jealous. The word seemed painful for him to say. Of who? You. I blinked. Me. He nodded. Your relationship with my father. For several seconds, I genuinely didn't know how to respond. Dad swallowed hard. You got the version of him I always wanted. The confession stunned me. For years, I had assumed he was the favorite. The chosen son. The heir. The one who received everything. Apparently, he had been carrying his own wounds all along. He was proud of you, I said softly. I know that now. His eyes filled with tears. But when you're young, knowing isn't always enough. I understood that. Probably more than he realized. Sometimes people spend entire lives chasing approval they already have. Dad shook his head. I focused on the ranch. He looked toward me. Then I focused on money. Another pause. Then I focused on proving myself. His voice dropped lower. And somewhere along the way I stopped focusing on people. The honesty hurt. Because it was true. Not just about him. About many people. Maybe all people. We get distracted. We confuse success with meaning. Achievement with fulfillment. Possession with happiness. Grandpa had understood the difference. Dad was only now learning it. A few days later, Stephen visited. The conversation was even more surprising. For once there was no defensiveness. No excuses. No competition. No argument. Just honesty. He sat across from me in Dad's living room. The same room where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays for decades. The same room where countless family disagreements had unfolded. Yet this conversation felt different. "I owe you an apology." I studied him carefully. He looked exhausted. Older. Much older than the confident businessman who had laughed at the inheritance meeting. What for? His laugh was humorless. Where should I start? Neither of us smiled. "I treated you badly." He looked down. For years, the room remained silent. Then he added the words I never expected to hear. I was wrong. No explanation. No justification. No blame. Just accountability. Rare. Simple. Powerful. I could have punished him. Emotionally, I mean. I could have listed every hurt. Every insult. Every slight. Every year of feeling invisible. Part of me even wanted to. For about 3 seconds. Then I remembered Grandpa's letter. The treasure was knowing who you are when nobody believes in you. I knew who I wanted to be. And it wasn't a bitter old woman keeping score. "I forgive you." Stephen looked stunned. Just like that. "Number." I smiled gently. "Not just like that. Years of pain don't disappear instantly. But forgiveness begins with a decision. And I was making one. The following months brought healing. Not perfection. Healing. There's a difference. Families don't magically become healthy overnight. But they can become healthier. Dad recovered slowly. Stephen began restructuring the company with more humility than before. Conversations became easier. Honesty became more common. For the first time in years, we actually felt like a family. Not because of money, not because of inheritance, because we had finally started telling the truth. As for me, I made a decision. Part of the compensation associated with the recovered historical collection came to me legally. Far more money than I ever expected. Far more than I needed. So I used it differently. I established a scholarship fund for veterans' families. I partnered with local historical organizations. I helped create educational programs preserving stories from older generations before those stories disappeared forever. Because that's what Grandpa had really protected. Not documents, stories, lessons, values, memory. A year later, we held a small ceremony near the ranch. Nothing elaborate. Just family, friends, veterans, neighbors. The kind of gathering Grandpa would have appreciated. At sunset, I stood beside a memorial plaque honoring Walter Carter. The Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above us. Golden light covered the hills. For a moment, everything felt exactly right. People often ask me whether I was angry when my father got the ranch and my brother got the company. The answer is yes. For a while I was. People ask whether I felt vindicated when the truth came out. A little, if I'm honest. But those feelings didn't last. Because eventually I realized something. Grandpa didn't leave Dad the ranch because it was the most valuable thing. He didn't leave Stephen the company because it was the most important thing. And he didn't leave me the key because it was worth millions. He left each of us a lesson. Mine simply took longer to understand. Today the brass key sits inside a display case in my home. Visitors often ask about it. Sometimes I tell the full story. Sometimes I don't. But whenever I look at it, I remember Grandpa's final gift. Not the key. Not the documents. Not the recognition. The lesson. The truth. The understanding that character matters when nobody is watching. That kindness matters when nobody rewards it. That integrity matters when nobody notices. And that sometimes the inheritance that looks worthless becomes the one that changes your life. If this story reminded you of someone you've loved, someone you've lost, or someone you still need to forgive, I hope you'll take a moment to think about them today. And if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or forgotten, remember this. Your value is not determined by what people give you. It's determined by who you choose to become. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart, feel free to share it with someone who may need the reminder. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family forgiveness, and second chances, I'd be honored to have you join me again.